In today's note, we're going to be looking at the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle is another one of the biogeochemical cycles that we're going to be looking at. We've already looked at the carbon cycle and the water cycle, and this one is basically the same idea. It's all the different processes in moving nitrogen throughout the environment. So again, nitrogen atoms move throughout living things, dead things, the air, soil, and water. So again, the nitrogen cycle is just how it moves through that, or all the different processes that are required in moving nitrogen through the environment. This is just an overview of the nitrogen cycle. So basically we have nitrogen in the atmosphere, or the N2 gas, or nitrogen gas. So we can see that up here. So that nitrogen kind of goes into either the soil through bacteria, or it goes from the atmosphere, which then goes into the soil, or into water, and then it kind of goes into plant life, and then from there it can go into animals, and then that kind of goes back into the soil and so on, and that can get released back into the environment. So we're going to look at kind of this entire process, but this is just an overview. So the nitrogen cycle, so 80% of the Earth's atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, right? So there is a large amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere, in the air that we breathe. And plants and animals need nitrogen to make amino acids, proteins, and DNA. So these are kind of like basically the building blocks. They help with cellular respiration. They help the cells grow. And plants and animals need nitrogen to make this happen. However, the only problem is that the nitrogen in the air, or the nitrogen gas, is not in a form that plants and animals can use. Right? We can breathe in the nitrogen when we breathe in, or when we inhale air. But we can't use that nitrogen to help make these amino acids, proteins, and DNA. So what has to happen is this nitrogen in the atmosphere needs to be converted into usable forms. And the way it does this is through a process called nitrogen fixation. So basically, we're just going to look at the kind of ways that this can happen, not basically how it happens. But basically, there are microorganisms or bacteria that can take nitrogen gas and convert it into a variety of nitrogen-containing compounds. Right? So we have nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. So these are some of the compounds that organisms or organic matter can use. Lightning and UV light can also fix small amounts of nitrogen, or basically turn it into usable forms. And how this works is basically the lightning splits up the nitrogen in the atmosphere and allows it to combine or react with other elements to produce the compounds that we need, or that organisms need. And finally, looking in terms of plant matter, we can add nitrogen to the ground through fertilizer. So we can actually manually do that, and then that allows plants to absorb nitrogen. So just kind of an overview, again, just more visual of it. So on the left over here, we have nitrogen fixing bacteria and root nodules. So these are the root nodules, and we can see kind of the bacteria around them. So basically what happens is the bacteria works in partnership with the plants. So there's bacteria that takes the nitrogen out of the air, converts it into a usable form, and gives it to the plants. And in return, the plants provide bacteria sugar. So it's a partnership between the two, where they each get something that they need. In the middle, we just have lightning, and we talked about just previously, lightning splits the nitrogen molecules that are in the atmosphere, and this allows those nitrogen molecules to combine with oxygen, which then produces one of the compounds that we can use. And finally, fertilizer. Fertilizer is just a way that we can give nitrogen to plants. If you see on fertilizer, you may see this kind of 3 number system over here, the 24-25-4. This will be different on different fertilizers, but that just basically shows the amount of different elements in that fertilizer. So one being nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which plants can use. But again, that's just kind of what those numbers mean. and just showing that nitrogen is a main component of fertilizer. So the nitrogen cycle, again, continuing it. So we know that it's in the atmosphere. It needs to be converted into usable forms. And then plants can get this nitrogen from the soil or the water. So again, we talked about the bacteria in the soil that can get it into plants, and plants can also absorb it through the water. Animals can get nitrogen by eating plants. So the nitrogen that plants get, animals can eat them and then gain nitrogen from them, or they can also get it from eating other animals. When these organisms die, or the organic matter dies, their bodies begin to decompose, which then adds the nitrogen back into the soil or the water, right? And decomposers help this process. So again, we talked about in previous lessons about these cycles that matter cannot be created or destroyed. So the nitrogen that is in the humans or in this organic matter, once they die, it needs to get decomposed, or they decompose, and the nitrogen needs to then go back into the cycle, and it does through decomposers, which are just kind of like bacteria or fungi, basically organisms that feed on dead or decaying matter. This is just an overview again of the carbon or the nitrogen cycle, looking more at the kind of consumption of it. So we have the atmospheric nitrogen that can go into the soil through bacteria, which then can get absorbed into plants, which then plants are they use that nitrogen to grow, and then the plants can be eaten by animals or they die. And then either way, it kind of cycles back into decomposers, which break down the decaying matter and releases the nitrogen back into the soil, and we can see the different forms of nitrogen here. So again, we talked about how nitrogen can go from the atmosphere into the soil, into plants and animals, and then back into the soil. There is also bacteria in the soil that can break down the nitrogen that's in there and release it back into the atmosphere. So they can break down those nitrogen containing compounds to release nitrogen back into the atmosphere, and then the cycle starts all over again or just continues. And this process of releasing nitrogen back into the atmosphere is called denitrification. So again, basically, we have nitrogen fixation, which is getting nitrogen out of the air into the soil or the water, and then we have denitrification, where we take the nitrogen in the soil or the water and release it back into the atmosphere. And this is just kind of a microscopic view of some denitrifying bacteria at different stages of life. So this is bacteria that would release nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So human interaction. So human action can cause changes to the nitrogen cycle. We've seen how human action can interact or affect the carbon cycle by burning organic matter or by burning fossil fuels. We didn't talk so much about human interaction with the water cycle, but I'm sure you can come up with some ways of how humans can interact with that. Human action can also interfere or interact with the nitrogen cycle. So as we talked about, there is nitrogen-rich fertilizer, and humans use fertilizer on whether it's lawns or grass or crops to help the plants grow. This nitrogen-rich fertilizer can wash into streams and ponds. So this can be done, we saw in the water cycle. Water can travel through groundwater, so the water gets absorbed by the ground. It can travel into lakes and rivers and oceans. If there's nitrogen in that soil, it can get picked up and travel along with it. As well, we have animal waste that adds large amounts of nitrogen to the soil. So not just the dead and decaying matter of organic matter of plants and animals can release nitrogen. Also, animal waste can release nitrogen or add nitrogen to the soil. So while this may be normal in regular amounts, if you think of animals that exist in the wild, they would normally or naturally reduce or leave nitrogen in the soil through their waste. But if you think of large farms where we're cultivating or growing animals or producing animals or breeding animals at a large or a higher rate, that wouldn't naturally happen. You can think of the amount of animal waste that can get released into the soil there, as well as this kind of leads back into the fertilizer. If you add manure to the farm, to plant life or crops to help them grow, you're adding animal waste back into the soil. So this increased nitrogen has an effect. So we're increasing or adding nitrogen into the cycle. It does have an effect because it can cause plants to grow rapidly, which affects food webs. So if you think back to the food chain, food web gizmo that we did, if we increase the plant population, which can be done by increasing the amount of nitrogen in the soil, causing plants to grow rapidly. If we increase the plant population, the extra plants, or the more plant life there are, the more herbivores there may be, because they're feeding on the extra plant material that's there. So that will increase the herbivore population, which could then increase the secondary consumer population, which could increase the tertiary consumer population. But what happens when all the plants get eaten is that then it'll cause a decrease in everything else. So you could see this kind of wave of kind of increase and decrease drastic increase and drastic decrease go through a food chain or a food web. So here, this is another example of how human interaction can affect the nitrogen cycle and how that can have effects. So what we have here, this is an overview of Lake Erie. And what you see here in green, or this kind of green kind of mist or swirls on the edges, this is algae. And the algae is growing rapidly. This is not normal. Well, it shouldn't happen. But what's happening is the nitrogen in the soil from plants or from crops, or whether it's animal waste or fertilizer, whatever the case may be, it's all flowing into the lake, and the large amount of nitrogen in the lake is causing algae to bloom or grow rapidly, where you see kind of these algae blooms. So what's happening is there's more nitrogen or more algae being produced than is being consumed by certain animals and whatnot. So it's really growing rapidly. You can see another example here of a boat going through the algae. And so this has effects down the line, whether it's causing certain organisms to not be able to exist or to die off because there is too much algae. So they're using up all the nutrients in there or in this ecosystem. It's blocking sunlight, or it's causing the waters to become toxic, so other organisms can't live there. It just kind of has many different consequences, and just comes from having an increased amount of nitrogen pushed into this environment. So it just kind of shows how one small interaction, or how one interaction in the cycle, can cause it to kind of shift and kind of come out of regulation, or become dysregulated, you could say. So again, this is just looking at the nitrogen cycle and looking at the ways that the nitrogen can get transported or processed through the environment, through the living and non-living factors, and just how human interaction can affect that.